Chapter 18. My brother, the monster slayer, has received all the training a monster slayer can have. He has learned how to protect himself, how to guard others, and when to sacrifice others. As a child, he learned all the wisdom of our people, wisdom that he is finally putting to use. But those in charge do not understand. They order my brother around as if they are riding a blindfolded pony through a forest at full speed, while they are blindfolded also. Such action can bring only pain, both to the rider and the pony. 3 more Humvees slid to a stop between the buildings of Agate, New Mexico. They carried the colonel and a dozen other men. Too late. They had arrived too late. Private Cheney wondered if that were on purpose. He stood, weapon to his shoulder, his gaze never moving from what had been the front of a small grocery store, now riddled with bullet holes. A hardware store beside the grocery had a huge hole in the front where Corporal Nakai had shot an anti-tank weapon, just missing the creature. Smoke drifted from the hole like blood from a wound. As men poured out of the newly arrived vehicles, Cheney lowered his rifle, his hands shaking. That creature had really been something. Its arms and legs like a man, yet it clearly wasn't human. It had cleared that grocery store in a single leap, as if simply jumping over a rock. And the creature had used a man's head as a weapon. In his entire life, Cheney would never forget the image of that head smashing into the windshield of the Humvee. There was no doubt in his mind that they were all lucky to be alive. He forced himself to take a few deep breaths of the warm desert air. Originally, he was from Boston, where the air was thick, a comforting weight that wrapped around a person and held him like a blanket holds a baby. He loved that air, and as soon as his hitch was up, he was headed back to work in his uncle's shipping factory on the harbor. It wouldn't be much of a job, but it would be a hell of a lot better than chasing monsters around a desert at night. The colonel climbed out of the second Humvee and walked over to Major Lee. An aide followed closely behind. Lee was surveying the damage as if he'd never seen anything like it before. And he probably hadn't. Cheney hadn't, that was for sure. He doubted that many of the men had. Corporal Nakai remained sitting in the middle of the street, staring at where the monster had gone, shaking his head from side to side. Nakai didn't look frightened like the rest of the men. He just looked pissed. Cheney let out a sigh. He wasn't far from the colonel or the major, so he made sure the sigh was a small one. "I see you encountered the target," the colonel said. "Yes, sir," Major Lee said. "I sure hope those buildings are evacuated. It's action like this that gets civilians killed." "The target got one," Lee said, pointing at the wrecked car and the head on the nearby sidewalk. "We saved another." The colonel turned to look. His lips tightened when he saw the head. Cheney had seen the other head, near that cold campfire, but it hadn't been the same as seeing a monster actually rip the head off a living human being. The guy hadn't even had time to scream. The colonel opened his mouth, but before he could say anything, Major Lee turned to 2 men nearby. "You two, help that man out of the car. Get him evacuated. You men, scout out those buildings for any civilian casualties." The major pointed at 3 others, and then at the hole in the front of the hardware store. "Get some water on those small fires in there before we burn down the entire town." The 7 men sprang into action, and Cheney stepped closer, waiting for his instructions. It seemed for the moment there wouldn't be any. The colonel stepped up in front of Major Lee. "Give me the rundown on what happened here." It took the major just 30 seconds to cover the details of the fight with the creature. The colonel clasped his hands behind his back and listened. Once he glanced at Nakai, who was still staring in the distance like a child who was waiting for his father to come home. "It seems like Nakai underestimated this thing," the colonel said, almost under his breath. But apparently Lee caught the sentence, just as Cheney had. "Yes, sir. I was well aware of that only a few moments before, sir." The colonel pivoted slightly and faced his aide. "Get me 30 more men, airlifted in here, full battle gear, ready for night action. And I'm going to set up a field camp right here on this street." "Yes, sir," the aide said, spun and headed for the Humvee. The colonel turned back to Major Lee. "I want you and 3 others to figure out which direction this creature headed, but don't follow until I give the word. We're going after this thing with enough men to make sure we stop it." "Understand, sir," Major Lee said. He turned. "Nakai, Mayhew, and Cheney, come with me." Cheney started at the sound of his own name. He had been expecting an order, but not one that had him alongside Major Lee. Cheney was so surprised he almost missed the colonel's next sentence. "Not Nakai," the colonel said. "I want him here with me for the moment." The major only nodded, then shouted, "Corrales, you're with me." Cheney again forced himself to take deep breaths of the thin air. He could feel the fear in his stomach pounding upward, wanting to get out. But somehow he forced it back down. Lee tossed them all industrial strength flashlights. They had more lights in their gear, but when the major handed out specific lighting, you used it. The major just held his, without turning it on, and the others did the same. Lee gave them the signal, and they all fell in beside him as they headed towards the destroyed hardware store. Cheney peered at it. The blast from the missile launcher had ruined the facade. Inside, the automatic fluorescence still glowed, showing debris all over the floor. Nuts, bolts, nails were scattered across the tile like spilled rice. The buildings next to it also took damage, but not as much. The bullet holes would probably show up better in the daylight. And then, because he couldn't help it, he looked up. Part of him had hoped that the building was shorter than normal, that the creature had topped them because they were so easy to jump over. But they weren't. No human could jump over them in a single bound, not without jets attached to his feet. The major turned down a side street. Cheney followed, glad to be beyond the destruction. The litter that covered the town was still present here, but there was no more dirt on this side of the street than there was in the back alleys of South Boston. That soothed him just enough. The desert was surprisingly close. One moment Lee, Cheney, and the others were in Agate. The next, they were in the desert. There were still scattered buildings, but very few. Outside one was a dog chain, with a dog collar at the end of it. Cheney didn't get close enough to see if there was any blood. Lee switched on his flashlight and pointed it at the ground. The others did the same. The monster had to land somewhere, and wherever it was, he would leave a trail. It took Major Lee and Cheney less than 5 minutes to pick up the creature's tracks. They were large and had ridges. Boots. The thing wore boots. Somehow, even though Cheney had seen it and its armor, he had thought that armor a part of the creature, just like an ant's armor was part of its body. The idea that this thing could remove its protection made it just a bit too intelligent for Cheney. He didn't mind fighting. In fact, he had itched for it a few months before. But he really didn't want to fight something that was smart, ruthless, and unpredictable. Cheney's light caught something green beside the footprints. Drops, like blood drops. He pointed his light at it, and Lee nodded. "It's hurt," Lee said. Maybe Nakai's blast had hurt it, or even one of Cheney's shots had found its mark. For some reason, that calmed Cheney's nerves a little. If the creature could bleed, they stood a chance against it. Lee shut off his flashlight. The others did the same. They stood for a moment in the dark. Cheney's heart was pounding. He felt curiously vulnerable, as though even the stars had eyes. "Night goggles," Major Lee ordered as he snapped his into place. As he did, he checked his rifle, making sure he had a full magazine. Cheney did the same, managing to keep his hands from shaking too badly. "We're only going along this trail for a few hundred yards," Major Lee said. "We want to make sure it didn't double back into the town. Cheney, go 20 meters to the left. Mayhew, 20 to the right. Corrales, you and I will stay on the trail." Without a word, the four split up, moving off through the desert like ghosts. The night goggles lit up the desert, giving everything a flat green tint. Cheney had trained a number of times in the goggles, but always hated it. The last thing he wanted was to get into a fight with them on. But in the dark, it was better to have them than not to have them. He moved right, away from the Major, alternating watching the ground and the horizon ahead. Cheney found his path moving him along the right side of a ridge as Major Lee and Corrales followed the creature's trail up a ravine. Within 50 paces he couldn't see the other men, and he had to force himself to stay calm and breathe the warm night air. Yet even focusing on that, he found himself holding his breath and listening. After about 200 paces along the ridge, he started across a flat, sandy area. In front of him was a shallow puddle of the monster's green blood. Instantly, Cheney scanned both left and right, his finger on the trigger, ready to open fire. Nothing but the clear desert night greeted him. "Cheney, the trail is headed your way." Major Lee's voice echoed through the night air. Cheney cursed silently. They hadn't said they would be quiet, but he had assumed they would. If the thing was nearby, it had to hear them. Nonetheless, the Major expected an answer. "I found the trail, sir," Cheney managed to yell back. Suddenly, the creature seemed to spring up from the desert, like a snake from a pit, towering over the private. Under the helmet, Cheney could see razor-sharp teeth and thick strands of hair. The suddenness of it froze him in his tracks. His gun across his waist. He was looking up at a creature at least 7 feet tall. The creature reached out with one clawed hand and yanked the weapon from Cheney's grasp, like a parent taking away a toy from a child. The motion snapped Cheney forward, towards the monster, into the thick smell of death that now filled the night air. Cheney opened his mouth to scream. He had never felt so much terror in his life. He was going to die, and he wasn't ready. But at the hands of this creature, he had no choice. The last thing he clearly saw was the creature's mouth, saliva dripping. Then, with one swipe, the creature severed Cheney's head, and his body bounced on the sand. The predator held Cheney's head by its night goggles and raised its other fist in silent triumph. Then it attached the head to the rest of its trophies and continued its hunt in the dark.